look to the future. That means developing world-class, next-generation digital technology through 5G for mobiles and gigabit-capable full fibre. It is only by doing this that we will remain at the forefront of the technology revolution. In order to realise the full benefits of those technologies, though, we have to have confidence in the security and resilience of the infrastructure on which they are built. Keeping the country secure is the primary duty of a government to its people. This consideration precedes all others. There is, of course, no such thing as a perfectly secure network, but the responsibility of the government is to ensure that it is as secure as it possibly can be. That's why we conducted the telecom supply chain review to look at the long-term security of our 5G and full fibre networks. It set out plans to implement one of the toughest regimes in the world for telecom security, one which would shift from a model where the telecoms industry merely follows guidance to a model where standards would be enforced by legislation, one that would require all operators to raise security standards and combat a range of threats, whether from cybercriminals or state-sponsored attacks, and one which gave the government the necessary powers to keep our approach up to date as this technology develops. A critical aspect of this was how we address so-called high-risk vendors. Those are defined as those which pose greater security and resilience risks to the UK's networks. So in January, we set out to this House our conclusions on how we would define and restrict high-risk vendors, keeping them outside the network's core and away from critical infrastructure and sites. And Mr. Speaker, we have been clear-eyed from the start that Chinese-owned vendors, Huawei and ZTE, were deemed to be high risk. And we made clear that the National Cybersecurity Centre would review and update its advice as necessary. Clearly, since January, the situation has changed. On the 15th of May, the US Department of Commerce announced that new sanctions have been imposed against Huawei through changes to the foreign direct product rules. This was a significant material change and one that we have to take into consideration. These sanctions are not the first attempt by the US to restrict Huawei's ability to supply equipment to 5G networks. They are, however, the first to have potentially severe impacts on Huawei's ability to supply new equipment in the United Kingdom. The new US measures restrict Huawei's ability to produce important products using US technology or software. The National Cybersecurity Centre has reviewed the consequences of the US's actions. The NCSC has now reported to ministers that they have significantly changed their security assessment of Huawei's presence in the UK's 5G network. Given the uncertainty that this creates around Huawei's supply chain, the UK can no longer be confident it will be able to guarantee the security of future Huawei 5G equipment affected by the change in US foreign direct product rules. To manage this risk, they have now issued new advice on the use of Huawei in UK telecoms networks. So this morning, the Prime Minister chaired a meeting of the National Security Council. Attendees at that meeting took full account of the National Cybersecurity Centre's advice, together with the implications for UK industry and wider geostrategic considerations. The government agrees with the National Cybersecurity Centre's advice. The best way to secure our networks is for operators to stop using new affected Huawei equipment to build the UK's future 5G networks. So to be clear, from the end of this year, telecoms operators must not buy any 5G equipment from Huawei. And once the Telecom Security Bill is passed, it will be illegal for them to do so. But we also recognise the range of concerns voiced in this House regarding Huawei's role in our 5G network. I have listened carefully to those concerns, and I do agree that we need clarity on our position and to take decisive action. Mr. Speaker, I have previously set out our plans to safely manage the presence of high-risk vendors in our 5G network. And of course, our ambition right from the very beginning was that no one should need to use a high-risk vendor for 5G at all. But I know that honourable members have sought a commitment from the government to remove Huawei equipment from our 5G network altogether. This is why we have concluded that it is necessary and indeed prudent to commit to a timetable for the removal of Huawei equipment from our 5G network by 2027. Let me be clear. This requirement will be set out in law by the Telecom Security Bill. By the time of the next election, we will have implemented in law an irreversible path for the complete removal of Huawei equipment from our 5G networks. Mr. Speaker, we have not taken this decision lightly, and I must be frank about the decision's consequences for every constituency in this country. This will delay our rollout of 5G. Our decisions in January had already set back that rollout by a year and cost up to £1 billion. Today's decision to ban the procurement of new Huawei 5G equipment from the end of this year will delay rollout by a further year and will add up to £500 million to costs. Requiring operators, in addition, to remove Huawei equipment from their 5G networks by 2027 will add hundreds of millions of pounds further to the cost and further delay rollout. This means a cumulative delay to 5G rollout of 2 to 3 years and costs of up to £2 billion. This will have real consequences for the connections on which all our constituents rely. And I have to say that to go faster and further beyond a 2027 target would add considerable and indeed unnecessary further costs and delays. And of course, the shorter we make the timetable for removal, the greater the risk of actual disruption to mobile telephones networks. The world-leading expertise of NCSC and GCHQ has enabled us to publish one of the most detailed analyses of the risks to the 5G network. The UK is now acting quickly, decisively, and ahead of our international partners. Our approach reflects the UK's specific national circumstances and how the risks from these sanctions are manifested here in the UK. This has not been an easy decision, but it is the right one for the UK's telecoms networks, for our national security and our economy, both now and indeed in the long run. We also, though, need to look at other networks. Although these are fundamentally different to 5G, as many members of this House have pointed out in the past, they need to be as secure and resilient as our new mobile technology. So, reflecting again the advice of the National Cybersecurity Centre, we will need to take a different approach to full fibre and older networks, one that recognises that they are different to 5G in terms of their technology, their security, and indeed the vendors supporting them. Given there is only one other appropriate scale vendor for full fibre equipment, we are going to embark on a short technical consultation with operators to understand their supply chain alternatives so that we can avoid unnecessary delays to our gigabit ambitions and prevent significant resilience risks. That technical consultation will determine the nature of our rigorous approach to Huawei outside the 5G networks. Of course, all of this, Mr. Speaker, has implications for the Telecom Security Bill. I am fully aware of the commitment that I made in this House in March to introduce it before the summer recess. As I'm sure honourable members will appreciate, today's decision, however, will substantially change what is in that bill. We will, though, of course, introduce the bill to the House in the autumn. Of course, it is in all of our interests for this legislation to be introduced and passed as soon as possible, because this is the key point. We have to ensure that our telecom security advice is on a secure statutory footing. And as this House knows, one of the reasons we're in this situation is because of a global market failure. Put simply, countries around the world, not just in the United Kingdom, have become dangerously reliant on too few vendors. We have already set out a clear and ambitious diversification strategy. That strategy will include wide-ranging action in the short, medium and long term with the aim of driving competition and innovation to grow the market and deliver greater resilience across all of our networks. The strategy will focus on 3 core elements. First of all, we need to secure the supply chains of our incumbent non-high-risk vendors by putting in place measures and mitigations that will protect supply chains and ensure there is no disruption to our networks. Second, bringing new scale vendors into the UK market by removing barriers to entry, providing commercial incentives and creating large-scale opportunities for new vendors to enter the UK market. And third, addressing the existing structure of the supply market by investing in research and development and building partnerships between operators and vendors that will mean operators using multiple vendors in a single network will become the standard across the industry. Success will, of course, require a shared commitment between government and industry to take the necessary steps to address this issue. We are already engaging extensively with operators, vendors, and governments around the world about supporting and accelerating the process of diversification. And, of course, we recognise that this is a global issue that requires international collaboration to deliver a lasting solution. So we're working with our Five Eyes partners and our friends around the world to bring together a coalition to deliver our shared goals. Now, I know in addition that many members of this House have considered the government's policy on high-risk vendors in the context of the United Kingdom's wider relationship with China. Let me assure members that this government is clear-eyed about China. We have been robust in our response to the imposition of new security laws in Hong Kong, including through our generous offer to British national overseas passport holders. What we want is a modern and mature relationship with China based on mutual respect, where we're able to speak frankly when we disagree, but also to work side by side with China on the issues where our interests converge. Today's decision, however, is about ensuring the long-term security of our telecoms network, specifically in the light of those new US sanctions. The security and resilience of our telecoms networks is of paramount importance. We have never and will never compromise that security in pursuit of economic prosperity. It is a fact that the US has introduced additional sanctions on Huawei, and as facts have changed, so has our approach. That is why we have taken this decision that there can be no new Huawei equipment from the end of this year and set out a clear timetable to exclude Huawei completely by 2027 with an irreversible path implemented by the time of the next election. Telecoms providers will be legally required to implement this by the Telecom Security Bill, which we will bring before this House shortly. Mr. Speaker, this important decision secures our networks now and lays the foundations for a world-class telecoms security framework in the future, and I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for advice cite of this statement. Now, all sides of the House agree that the first duty of any government is to protect its citizens. And we have confidence in our national security services who go to such lengths to keep us safe. It has been clear for some time that there are serious questions over whether Huawei should be allowed to control large sections of our country's telecoms networks. Yet the government refused to face reality. Their approach to our 5G capability, Huawei, and our national security has been incomprehensibly negligent. The current Education Secretary was sacked as Defence Secretary for leaking parts of the security services advice on Huawei, and yet the government then went on to ignore large parts of it. In January, the Foreign Secretary said in a statement to this House that they would legislate at, I quote, the earliest opportunity on high-risk vendors. Then they refused to work with us and their own backbenchers to enable this to happen. So will the Secretary of State tell us when he will bring forward legislation on high-risk vendors, including the robust regulation and enforcement powers required to limit or eliminate their part in our network, and as soon as possible and shortly will not wash anymore? And will the government publish the security advice on which today's decision has been taken? What new information the government was given that was not available to them when the initial decisions were made? I would like to ask the Secretary of State what discussions he has had with the Foreign Secretary and the Trade Secretary on likely retaliation. Where else are we dependent on Chinese suppliers, for example, in our nuclear sector? And how are we working with our democratic allies, including but not limited to the United States, to develop alternatives in these areas? The Secretary of State says this change is in response to US sanctions. But in the past, he has emphasized how closely he was working with the United States. So were the sanctions a surprise? And is our security policy being led by the US? And did the very visible human rights violations of the Chinese in Hong Kong and against the Uyghur play no part in this decision? The reality, Mr. Speaker, is that the original decision on Huawei was made because over the past decade, this government has failed to deliver a sustainable plan for our digital economy. Almost exactly 1 year ago, when the Telecoms Supply Chain Review report was published, it said, we will develop and pursue a diversification strategy, including by working with our international partners to ensure a competitive, sustainable and diverse supply chain. Now he claims to have set out a clear and ambitious diversification strategy, which will come as a surprise to anyone who has looked at their statements. So I would like to ask the Secretary of State, what are the actions that implement this strategy, which has effectively been set out somewhere which I have not seen? And can you tell me where it is set out? Mr. Speaker, this is a car crash for our digital economy, but one which could have been visible from outer space. BT and other vendors have put the cost of this decision in the billions. He says 2 billion. What is the basis for this estimate, and how will he ensure the cost is not passed on to consumers? Today's announcement refers to 5G, but what are the implications for our emergency services network, a saga even longer than this one where BT were planning to use Huawei? Open standards such as Open RAN limit dependence on any one supplier. What is he doing to mandate such standards and open our networks to UK companies such as the Cambridge company IP Access and the North East company Filtronic? Crucially, what proportion of the additional money which is spent will go to UK companies, and how many jobs will be created here? The government recently announced a $500 million investment in a bankrupt American satellite broadband provider, OpenWeb. Are similar investments planned for 5 or 6G companies? Mr. Speaker, Labour has repeatedly offered constructive ideas to get the UK out of the Huawei hole. We have consistently argued to end our national dependence on all high-risk vendors and improve corporate responsibility for global supply chains. This entire saga has shown that the government cannot sort this mess out on their own. We need a task force of industry representatives, academics, startups, regional governments and regulators to develop a plan which delivers a UK network capability and secure mobile network in the shortest possible time frame. Will he commit to that and return to the House regularly to update the House on progress? Will the Secretary of State get a grip, get a plan and secure our critical communications infrastructure, our digital economy and our national security?
Secretary of State.
Well, the Honourable Lady raised a large number of questions. I'll attempt to address as many of them as I can, Mr. Speaker. She asked when the bill will be brought back. I don't know whether she was listening to what I said. I said the autumn. That remains the case. Will we publish the security advice? Yes, we will publish a summary of the security advice. That will contain the essence of it. She was asked me what was new. The new fact was the fact that we had these US sanctions imposed post-January. That's why we sought the advice from the NCSC. She asked about whether we would consider wider relations with China and response. Of course, the National Security Council considered those matters, but she wouldn't expect me to go into detail on the floor of the House on that. She asked about working on alternatives. We are already working with all our Five Eyes partners on those alternatives. So the first thing we need to do is ensure that we protect the other two vendors in this market, so Nokia and Ericsson. Secondly, we need to get new suppliers in. That starts with Samsung and it starts with NEC. My honourable friend, the Minister for Digital Infrastructure, who's sitting next to me, has had constructive discussions with them, and we are now at the stage of having technical engagement at a technical level with their officials. Of course, she is entirely right to point to the future, which is an Open RAN network. Now, there's only one Open RAN network currently in the world, and that is in Japan, and that was in a situation where they started the network from scratch. There are big barriers to it, but of course that is the objective we're working towards. So that means working with our partners through international institutions to set the right common standards upon which we can have an Open RAN network. It means working with the telecoms providers to provide the right incentives for them to switch from a single vendor to the Open RAN network. But in the end, an Open RAN network is going to provide the opportunity for UK providers, alongside providers from other allies and other countries around the world, to start providing that telecoms infrastructure. I must say, though, I do find it extraordinary. The Honourable Lady spoke for several minutes. She still has not said, does she support this decision, yes or no? Will she be backing it, yes or no? She says that we were negligent. I would gently remind the Honourable Lady, it was the Labour government that opened the door to Huawei in the first place. It is this government that is closing it. It was the Labour Party that left us reliant on a small number of suppliers. We are diversifying it. And indeed, it was the Labour Party as late as 2018 which was advocating for high-risk vendors to be in the network. We have stopped that. Thank you.
We now come to the Chair of the Select Committee, Julian Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I just say, first of all, I do broadly welcome the tone and content of this statement. After what could be said a significant false start, the Minister has outlined a much more tenable position. After all, our corrective security trumps, so to speak, economics. Having said that, we still have a major job upgrading our digital infrastructure. Will the Minister make clear what extra measures he will take to ensure that we don't fall further behind our competitors in terms of 5G and gigabit-capable broadband due to the disruption caused by this decision, and what this will mean for consumers? And can he assure the House that his decision today is a final one, a future-proofed one, and one that can't be reversed in the future by any other government?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. Look, he is absolutely right about this point. How do we ensure that this is future-proof? The first thing we have said throughout all of this, of course, we will depend on advice from the NCSC, and we will keep our security situation under review. But in terms of the irreversibility of the decision to remove Huawei from the 5G network, first of all, it will be in the bill, so that will be set out in statute. But secondly, we will get to a point by the time we get to the end of this Parliament where the flow of Huawei equipment into 5G has been stopped. We will be well through the path of the stop, because we've set out this path to the end of 2027. Unless the party opposite is going to say that they will come into office and immediately repeal all of this legislation and instruct all telecoms providers to almost exclusively procure Huawei, we have dealt with Huawei in the 5G network through this announcement.
Let's us head to Scotland to the SNP spokesperson, John Nicholson. John Nicholson.
Well, here we go again, Mr. Speaker, sir. Another screeching handbrake turn. When we debated this in January, we on the SNP benches warned the government that Huawei could not be trusted with our 5G mobile network. Security experts were clear. We should not open up the central nervous system of our modern society to a company owned by the Chinese Communist Party. With that characteristic combination of error and overconfidence, the Foreign Secretary opined that I'd got my analysis wrong on all counts. But it seems not. Less than 6 months later, and we're witnessing yet another volte-face, fast becoming the hallmark of this government. Small wonder then that ministers and backbenchers are reluctant to be wheeled out in defence of a government policy on Monday, knowing that they could be required to argue the polar opposite on Tuesday. Of course it's right that Huawei should be banned from the UK's mobile networks, but it's a decision that should have been taken long ago. As I said to the Foreign Secretary in January, had the government acted in 2018 as the Australians did, our mobile operators' 5G rollout plans would have been in an infinitely healthier place. As it is, we will now pay the price for the government's ineptitude. We know it, the Secretary of State knows it, and increasingly restive Tory backbenchers know it. So how was it, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister thought that China and Huawei could be trusted, or at least managed, in January, but not now in July? Was it that a Brexit Britain was too weak and isolated to upset the world's second largest economic powerhouse? but the government has now been forced to acknowledge that it cannot sacrifice our national security even for Brexit. Countering the intelligence threat posed by China will require more than just the phase out of Huawei. It will involve a rethink of our investment in native companies. We must now also work to protect our 999 emergency services network from the fallout of this decision. Will the Minister outline how exactly he will do so? We welcome this climb down. What will the Minister now do after all the government's mistakes to help us catch up?
Secretary of State.
Well, the honourable gentleman talks about the January 2020 advice. That was based on advice from the National Cyber Security Centre, who were working with GCHQ. And with all respect to the honourable gentleman, I think they are probably a better source to rely upon than the honourable gentleman. And as a result of that advice, we were absolutely clear-eyed about the threat from Chinese vendors. That's why we deemed Huawei and ZTE as high-risk vendors. That's why we banned them, to his point, from the core of the network, and that's why we imposed a cap and we banned them from the most sensitive elements. It is, though, a fact that the United States has imposed these sanctions on Huawei. The consequence of these sanctions, as we've been advised by the NCSC, is that we can no longer rely upon Huawei equipment. Therefore, it is in the security interests of the United Kingdom to ban any further use of that equipment by ruling out further purchase of it. That is the right thing to do in the national interest. If the facts change, we change our policy, and that is exactly what we have done, and we will then enshrine it in law through the through the Telecoms Security Bill. He talks about investment in other companies. There are important points raised there, and we're addressing that through the Investment Security Bill, which will also be coming before this House. Throughout all of this, we've been completely clear-eyed about the threat posed by Chinese companies and taken appropriate steps in relation to it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for his statement. But it does mean that as a result of this decision, we are reliant on just two companies for most of our mobile telecommunications equipment. And this and the delay to 5G that he talked about reflects, as he said, a long-term failure of UK telecom strategy to anticipate what the country would need and to prepare for it. So is it still the Secretary of State's view that the UK can develop, as he said in March, new supply chain capacity during this Parliament? And will he come to my select committee next week to discuss how he will do it?
Secretary of State.
Well, of course, I would be delighted to come to the Right Honourable Gentleman's Select Committee and outline in further detail the steps that we are taken. But again, in essence, it's secure the existing supplies, then get new ones in, and we are making good progress on that. But ultimately, it is this Open RAN solution. So that means doing things such as launching a flagship Open RAN test beds with mobile network operators. It means establishing Open RAN systems integration expert centre through the National Telecoms Lab. We've got a whole range of measures which I'm happy to talk to him at length about.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I was in China with other MPs a couple of years back, our delegation leader, Ken Clark, kept going on about how this was a golden era for relations between our two countries. Obviously, another U-turn along with school dinners, face masks, NHS surcharge. So could they now apply some consistency with their risky regime standards and stop UK export of telecommunications spyware and wire traps to Bahrain, the Philippines, Saudi and UAE? Or did taking back control actually mean handing it over to Trump to settle his old scores and being special relationship poodle?
Secretary of State.
Well, I think the honourable lady knows that we have appropriate export controls in relation to all the things that she mentioned.
Yes, right, Mr.
Speaker, can my right honourable friend confirm if he shares my concerns of the recent coverage of Huawei and security apparatus in the province of Xinjiang, where human rights abuses are taking place against the Uyghur? And can my right honourable friend share what strategies or incentives are in place to support a domestic telecoms equipment supply capabilities to ensure we have homegrown alternatives to Huawei?
Secretary of State.
Well, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right to raise the appalling human rights abuses against the Uyghur in the Xinjiang province, and that the United Kingdom has led in the condemnation of that, working with other countries. She talked about the importance of diversification, and indeed several Honourable members have raised this. Of course, I'm happy to report regularly to this House. Indeed, I appear before this House in questions for DCMS every month. Very happy to update the House on the progress of all of those measures.
Steve McKay.
I suspect many folk will be wondering, Mr. Speaker, if the government's banning a Chinese tech company from our telecommunications industry on the grounds of national security, how come it's safe for them to participate in building a nuclear power station?
Secretary of State.
Well, the advice that we have received today relates to the impact of the US sanctions. The US has imposed sanctions specifically on 5G. We have analysed the impact of those sanctions, and it has undermined the reliability of Huawei equipment, which is now why we are now advising, and then will set out in statute, that mobile network operators can no longer purchase that equipment.
Anthony Magdal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the government's announcement today, and I welcome the fact that they have listened to members from across this House. And I think it is right that they have also taken action from the US approach and their implementation of sanctions. But if the government is going to be clear-eyed about China, it must also be clear-eyed about the human rights violations that are reportedly being undertaken by Huawei and their use of slave labour. It is not acceptable for a global Britain to be involved in a company that is perpetually using slave labour in their supply chains. So will he work with us and members across this House to ensure that we can bring forward that 2027 date?
Secretary of State.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his support, but I do think there are slightly separate questions about the timings and the issue of human rights abuses. He's absolutely right to raise the question about human rights abuses, and I think that is something that we are addressing through the Modern Slavery Bill. We should not be having any companies operating in the United Kingdom relying on slavery. So we've introduced the Modern Slavery Bill, and indeed there's an amendment that it will be considered in the Lords on very shortly, which deals precisely with this issue, and we're working with peers to address that.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too welcome this screeching U-turn. It is ultimately the right decision on the grounds of national security, human rights and British industrial strategy. Would he agree with me that the best way to mitigate the risks of relying on just two vendors is for the government to invest in the development of the open radio access network and open up the market to newer, smaller entrants? And if he does, when will he publish a strategy to achieve that?
Secretary of State.
Well, the honourable lady is absolutely right. Of course, in the medium to long run, Open RAN is the solution. I just have to caution that that is not available immediately. So in the shorter run, that is why we are also working on trying to introduce further existing vendors into the United Kingdom, principally Samsung and NEC.
Nick Drummond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also welcome the Secretary of State's statement? But will my right honourable friend commit the government to further financial support for research and development to enable the UK telecommunications industry to move fast so that we can fill the gap as quickly as possible?
Secretary of State.
Well, I think my honourable friend raises a very important point, and of course the Chancellor was at the National Security Council when we were discussing this. Clearly, in order to facilitate the Open RAN solution, that will require investment from the government, but that will be a matter for the Chancellor at a future fiscal event.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has been particularly clear that Huawei will not be asked to deliver the UK's 5G network, but he's been conspicuously quiet in relation to when the 5G network will now be complete across the UK. So can he clarify for myself and for members across the chamber, when will 5G be delivered across the United Kingdom, and at what cost?
Secretary of State.
Well, we set out our position in the manifesto, but what has changed here is that we have had, as a consequence of these decisions, I've been very frank and upfront with the House about this, the consequence of both the decision to stop the flow of Huawei equipment into 5G and setting a very firm date for 2027, and the pathway to that will add 2 to 3 years to the delivery time.
David Jones.
Mr. Speaker, the Chinese government has of late struck an increasingly aggressive posture against countries such as Australia and India, and also against this country, effectively tearing up the Sino-British Declaration and imposing draconian laws on Hong Kong. And when it learned of calls from this place for the exclusion of Huawei from our national telecoms infrastructure, its ambassador threatened this country with unspecified consequences. Does my right honourable friend agree that that threat confirms not only the close connection between Huawei and the Chinese government, but also the fact that the right decision has been made today?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his question. This government will not be cowed by the comments of any other country, and indeed this decision has been made in the national security interests of this nation. Indeed, he's absolutely right to raise the abuses in Hong Kong, and the Foreign Secretary has dealt with that extensively.
Let's head to Denton and Reddish and visit Andrew Gwynn. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. The National Institute for Economic and Social Research says that removing Huawei from 5G infrastructure will lead to higher prices, and as the Secretary of State's already said to the House, also a delayed rollout. So what will his department be doing to ensure that this decision doesn't increase the digital divide that exists in this country? And what conversations has he had or will he be having with local authorities about the impact of planned infrastructure work?
Well, he's absolutely right to raise the point about digital divide, and that's something that my department is working on extensively, for example, in ensuring that there is more handheld equipment and all those sort of things for people who don't currently have it, mobile phone technology and so on. We've invested a lot of money in relation to that. The point that he makes in relation to local authorities, we are actually, as a result of our manifesto commitment, a highly ambitious target of full fibre rollout by 2025. That is creating a huge investment across the country. Indeed, just 10,000 new jobs were announced very recently by a telecoms provider. There's lots of potential for more jobs in this area.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Significant disruption to either mobile or broadband services could potentially have a disastrous impact on essential services. So will the Secretary of State today assure the House that everything possible is being done to mitigate and manage the risk involved in Huawei's continued involvement in our telecoms infrastructure?
Secretary of State.
Yes, of course, we will continue to manage and mitigate that risk. That's why we announced those measures back in January, which were to cap and exclude, and this is now why we are further reinforcing this with a pathway by 2027 to having zero Huawei in 5G. But we'll continue to work, particularly through the Huawei Evaluation Centre in GCHQ, on the security risks in relation to Huawei.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On 2 occasions now, the Secretary of State has made reference to the Five Eyes partnership, and then a more oblique reference to wider alliances. No reference to the D10 alliance that was trailed 5 weeks ago, which is G7 countries and Australia, South Korea and India. So could the Secretary of State give us an indication? Has the D10 alliance been established? Does it exist? Is there a unity of purpose? And are the other members of the proposed alliance at one with us in the decision that has been made today?
Secretary of State.
Well, the honourable gentleman is right to raise the D10 alliance. The D10 alliance wasn't actually something that was proposed by the UK government. I believe it was proposed by the Atlantic Forum, but we are, of course, working with all the D10 countries on this, and indeed others, such as Japan, South Korea and others, where we have a lot of interest in that.
Sir John Randolph.
There could be offsets to the delay in cost if, as a result of this, we design and manufacture many more of the components we need here at home. So what exactly can the government do to make that more likely to create jobs and technology?
Yes. Secretary of State.
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this point, and that is the opportunity created by Open RAN technology, because it is, frankly, it's going to take a very long time indeed, were the United Kingdom minded to do so, to create a new mobile vendor of the likes of Ericsson and Nokia, indeed Huawei. But by having Open RAN, we can get UK technologies into the provisions of telecom infrastructure, and that can sit alongside contributions from other like-minded countries around the world. That's the way we'll create jobs and provide a long-lasting solution to this.
Basically, the government's mobile telephony strategy is in tatters. And what's particularly sad about it is this wasn't only predictable, it was predicted by dozens of members of Parliament who kept on saying this repeatedly to the government, that this is where we were going to get to in the end. And I just wish the government sometimes would listen to its own backbenchers sometimes more often. And obviously these backbenchers as well, because there is unity in the House on this matter, and there has been for some considerable period of time. It feels as if the government, the minister today, is like St. Augustine. Make be chaste, but not yet. All he's offering us is a path towards getting rid of these sometime in 2027 after the next general election. And he won't even tell us when autumn is. So will he tell us precisely when's he going to publish his bill, when will it be enacted, and why can't he bring forward the date from 2027?
Well, as ever, the honourable gentleman is very good at false indignation and theatrics, but actually we look at the reality of this. It is this government, for the first time, unlike when the party opposite were in power, we have set out a clear date that will be enshrined through statute to remove Huawei equipment, and we are stopping the flow into the networks. And in order to do all of that, we have to bring forward the Telecom Security Bill, which I have said will be in the autumn. If he would like the definition of autumn, I believe those are in the months of September, October and November.
Tobias Selwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask humbly that we distinguish between the people of China and the communist regime? Because it is the latter that for years we've tried to appease in the hope that they would mature into a global citizen, and that clearly has not happened. President Xi seeks superpower status, but now with a competing vision of world order. So I very much welcome this announcement today. I ask whether he shared this announcement with the Five Eyes community, indeed the US friends. But we should also expect repercussions from China. And to that end, I strongly believe that this must be the start of a wider strategic foreign policy reset. Tactical announcements of sending carriers to the South China Sea is all very well, but it must form part of a wider international collective Western resolve to defend our values and our standards, for which China is very much welcome to participate, and I hope the UK will play a leading role.
Thursday.
I thank my right honourable friend for his question. He's absolutely right to distinguish between the people of China and the Chinese government. China is obviously a wonderful country, and I've very much enjoyed visiting it on occasions in the past, and it's very warm people there. The difference is the government of China and some of the abuses, particularly of the rule of law and human rights, that we have seen there. I think within the context of telecommunication security, we have an opportunity to work with our allies. If we can develop this Open RAN technology of the future, it has an opportunity not just to benefit us, but to benefit them, and indeed to further secure our infrastructure and make it more resilient.
Let's go to Hampstead and visit Tulip Sadiq. Tulip Sadiq.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There were very severe warnings from network providers over the weekend that stripping Huawei equipment out of our networks too quickly could lead to signal blackouts. Our national security must, of course, come first, but the government promised a levelling up of network infrastructure, which certainly wouldn't be consistent with blackouts. What assurances can the Minister give to my constituents that they will not have to endure this kind of disruption?
Secretary of State.
Well, the honourable lady is absolutely right to raise the risk of that kind of disruption and blackouts, and that was one of the reasons that led us to the timetable that we've set out. Put bluntly, the shorter the timetable for the removal, the higher the risk of that happening. But I can give the honourable lady, indeed her constituents and people up and down the country, that this risk will not materialise in relation to the proposals that we have outlined today.
Holding Ray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome his statement and his willingness to take tough decisions, particularly when, as the China Research Group believes, they're in their national interest. With the EU President recently having to take Beijing to task over its cyber attacks on EU hospitals treating patients for coronavirus, does this action today from the government not send the message out loud and clear to the Chinese state that our future relationship must be based upon trust and our trade on a fair and level playing field?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend is absolutely right to raise the issue of cyber attacks. I would caution, though, that cyber attacks will not be prevented by removing Huawei equipment from the system. There are vulnerabilities across the network, and indeed that is one of the reasons why we are introducing the Telecom Security Bill to start to address some of those. And indeed we have seen it's in the public domain that, for example, hostile Russian actors have already been able to attack our networks. With regard to the wider position on China, we need to have a full and frank relationship with China, and we have done that. But this announcement is principally about the US sanctions.
Let's head to Scotland and visit Peter Grant. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No matter how hard the Secretary of State tries to disguise it, this is a humiliating U-turn by a government being forced to admit that they got it wrong in January. Can the Secretary of State tell us what assessment has been made of the additional damage to the economy, the additional cost to public finances in the UK, and the additional cost to devolved nations of the UK of this government taking the decision today that everyone knows they should have taken 6 months ago?
Secretary of State.
I have to say to the honourable gentleman, he cannot simultaneously urge us to take a faster course, which the SNP did previously, and then attack us for the consequence of that in terms of cost. One thing leads to the other.
Mark Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome today's announcement. And the government has previously committed in its manifesto to improving mobile connectivity in rural constituencies like mine. Can my right honourable friend comment on how this decision will affect plans for improving rural networks in Derbyshire and elsewhere?
Secretary of State.
This announcement shouldn't impact on the rural networks and the way that we described. Made huge advances by signing this deal for single rural networks, which will help places just like Derbyshire.
Charlotte Littles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK has great science startups. Indeed, Warrington is considered the second best startup location in the UK, and we're proudly a key engine of growth for the Northern Powerhouse. What proportion of additional money spent to take Huawei out of our networks will go to UK companies? How many jobs will be created here? And will that investment be seen across the regions and nations of the UK?
Secretary of State.
Well, actually, as a result of the commitment that we have made for full fibre to be across the country with an ambitious target of 2025, will actually cause huge amounts of investment up and down the country, including the Honourable Lady's constituency. In addition to that, as we seek to develop an Open RAN solution, there will be opportunities for universities and others to contribute to that solution.
Graham.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State's announcement today is a delicate balancing act between security, economics and geopolitics, and it shifts the supply of made-in-China equipment from Huawei to made-in-China equipment from the 25,000 employees of Nokia and Ericsson there, creating a new duopoly of 5G televisions provision until such time as there is a credible Anglo-Saxon alternative. Could my right honourable friend confirm that as one of the goals for leaving the EU was for a new global Britain to develop deeper relations with growth nations, including in Asia, we must continue to find space to work closely with China on issues of mutual benefit, as well as confront her on issues where our values require it?
Well, as ever, my honourable friend is absolutely right to distinguish between confronting on issues such as human rights and having an open, commercial relationship with them, clearly subject to the rule of law. And I think that's the approach that we continue to pursue, notwithstanding this announcement.
We now come to Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The diminishing number of people in Scotland that still actually vote Tory tend to live in remote and rural areas, so I'm sure they'll be delighted that by the government's own admission it's breaching its manifesto promise to roll out the 5G as a result of decisions it has taken. So it's not illegitimate for us to be asking about the consequences of this in terms of the delays to the infrastructure, the costs it's going to be, and what, if any, discussions he's actually had with Scotland and the other devolved administrations about the impact of today's decision.
Secretary of State.
Well, in relation to discussions with the devolved nations, my honourable friend, the Minister for Digital Infrastructure, who sat next to me, will be having exactly those further conversations. I would have thought, though, the honourable gentleman would have welcomed, I didn't hear him say it at the time, when we announced the Shared Rural Network. That was a groundbreaking deal, bringing government money together with the telecoms networks to massively improve connectivity, particularly in Scotland, which had not been the case previously, up to well over 90% coverage. That's an amazing achievement.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement, which I welcome. Would he agree that now is the time to invest in our own domestic 5G capacity to support our future critical communications infrastructure? And to that end, could I urge him and his ministerial colleagues to consider seriously the Staffordshire proposal for a 5G connected region growth deal? This would establish both the first regional commercial 5G network in the UK and a wide area test and innovation network to support our future aspirations in this area.
State.
Well, as ever, my honourable friend is a robust advocate for his constituency, and exactly those conversations are going on now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Huawei Evaluation Centre was first set up by the National Cyber Security Centre 10 years ago. Huawei has been considered a high-risk vendor by 3 Prime Ministers. Why has decisive action taken so long, and many of the European alternatives to Huawei manufacture parts in China? Is the government looking at the security implications of that?
Secretary of State.
Well, we look at the security implications of whole supply chains. That's exactly what the National Cybersecurity Centre has been doing. That doesn't just apply to Huawei, it applies to the other vendors. And indeed, he's absolutely right to highlight this issue. Simply by removing Huawei from 5G networks, it does not deal with all of the security risks. That's why we need to bring forward the Telecom Security Bill as part of enhancing security.
Duncan Baker.
Well, I welcome what the Secretary of State today and the Prime Minister and the Government have done, putting national security in front of profit and telling the world that this sovereign nation will not be pushed around by any country. Can you just reassure me, Secretary of State, that we will still be able to work at breakneck speed to be able to roll out a 5G network around the country with credible, trustworthy partners, and recognise that as technology moves on, a lot of this will be done through software, not necessarily hardware?
Secretary of State.
Well, he makes a very important point about software versus hardware, and that goes to some of the wider discussions around Open RAN. Of course, we will always put national security first, and that is what we have done with this statement today.
Let's head to Wales with Howell Williams. Howell Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State said that countries around the world have become reliant on too few vendors. That includes the UK just half a year ago. Is his government in any way to blame?
State.
Well, I think there has been a failure of successive governments, both in the United Kingdom and indeed around the world, in terms of ensuring that we have sovereign capability. And actually, that sovereign capability doesn't just relate to telecoms vendors, it relates to other areas of emergent technology, and that is precisely why we're bringing forward the Investment Security Bill to greater empower the government to take decisions to protect our national interest in relation to investment in companies.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that the few existing vendors rely on component parts from China, and that will continue, I suspect, for some time to come. To make our move successful, other countries have got to come into line in the West with us. What guarantee can my honourable friend give us that other countries will follow us and thereby ensure that Huawei and Chinese influence is out completely of whatever network we set up in the future?
Tuesday.
Well, as my honourable friend will be aware, the US and Australia have already taken decisions in this respect. I think the Canadians have a similar sort of analysis to us, and they're yet to take a decision in relation to it. New Zealand has a slightly different process. I think around the world, each country is looking at how best to protect its telecoms networks, but also, and crucially, how they develop their own domestic alternatives, and that's why working cooperatively, for example, in relation to Open RAN, is exactly the way we can address this.
Head to Scotland with Cyril Monaghan. Cyril Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In January, the government announced that Huawei would be limited to 35%, but crucially not the core of the network. And whilst I welcome today's U-turn, I must point out that Huawei already exists at the core of the EE 4G network. 5G, of course, is then layered on top. BT have said it will take years to remove this. So how is the Secretary of State mitigating the risk posed by Huawei's continued presence at the core of EE's network?
Secretary of State.
Well, the first point to make is that all of that equipment will have been approved by the Huawei cell in GCHQ. But in addition to that, that is why we have introduced the ban on Huawei from the core, and now we have set this path down to zero.
Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's very clear that the latest US sanctions have changed the landscape, and therefore it's reasonable for the government to change its approach on Huawei. But would my right honourable friend agree that it would be naive to believe that the only threat to the UK telecommunications network will come through Huawei equipment or even solely from China, and therefore the appropriate response is to make sure the whole network is secure and that it's secure wherever the threat may come from?
State.
Well, as ever, my right honourable friend and indeed my predecessor is absolutely correct. It is just a reality that telecoms networks are always going to be vulnerable, particularly to sophisticated hostile state actors. That is why we brought forward the Telecom Security Bill to seek to address that. And we should not kid ourselves into thinking that there is a panacea with one silver bullet we can remove that risk by simply banning Huawei.
Geraint Davis in Swansea. Geraint.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister focuses on delays and costs, but he also knows that Huawei has contracts in the Xinjiang Public Services Bureau to deliver digital surveillance that oppresses 1 million Muslims, and they benefit from the slave trade. So does the Minister agree that in any major public procurement contract there should be due diligence of human rights? And why hasn't he done so in this case?
Secretary of State.
Well, it's not actually the case that the UK government is procuring from Huawei. It's the mobile network operators that are procuring from Huawei. But the point that he makes about modern slavery is absolutely correct, and that's why we brought forward the Modern Slavery Bill. And of course, those sort of considerations are undertaken in respect of public procurement.
We're wandering up to Bolton with Mark Logan. Mark Logan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And given the success of British government since the early 2000s, have worked to encourage Huawei and other private companies from China to invest in the UK, what sort of message do we feel that this may send in terms of consistency as a long-term, reliable international partner? And has it been examined as part of a kind of wider strategic policy for Britain's place in the world post-Brexit?
Secretary of State.
Well, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right to raise this point. The United Kingdom prides itself on the rule of law, a rules-based system, and consistency, and that will remain the case. And of course, we will welcome Chinese investment and investment from around the world. What has changed here are the US sanctions, and as a result of those US sanctions, we can no longer rely on Huawei equipment. Therefore, it's in the national interest to introduce this ban on new purchases from the beginning of the year.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for your indulgence. Can I say to my right honourable friend that I welcome, of course, the decision to eradicate Huawei from the 5G system. I do think, by the way, he can do it quicker than this. I was listening to the Today programme the other day, and the head of BT said, 7 years, yes, but we can do it in 5. So now let's bring it forward to 5 and make sure it happens quickly. There's no reason why they can't. But the key point I want to make is there are two contradictions in his statement. Having said he's getting rid of them in 5G, 4G and 3G, Huawei apparently are fine. They can go on for as long as anyone, and they will be upgraded in software upgrades for next decade. So if they're a risk in 5G, why are they not a risk to us generally, according to this? And the second thing is, on human rights, we know that Huawei has lied in their declaration under the Modern Day Slavery Act that they have had no involvement in slavery. We know that now from Xinjiang province. If we can prove that and are able to demonstrate it to this government, will this government ban Huawei altogether?
Well, first of all, my right honourable friend raises the distinction between 4G, 3G and 5G. First of all, 5G is the new technology. This is the successor to 3G and 4G. And indeed, as the right honourable gentleman said to this House previously, the reality of the 5G network is that it is fundamentally different. And it's a recognition of that fundamental difference that we are imposing these rules in respect of 5G. Of course, over time, 5G will replace it, and then in turn, 5G will be replaced by 6G. And in all of that, Huawei will be absent.
We now head to Folkestone and visit Damien Collins. Damien Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the statement, but the Huawei Cybersecurity Evaluation Centre's Oversight Board report says there are existing cybersecurity risks of the Huawei network in the UK, which the company has no plan to remedy, no credible plan to remedy. What will the Secretary of State be doing to seek to address those existing cybersecurity risks in the network before 2027?
Secretary of State.
Well, obviously the most blunt way of doing that is to ban the flow from the beginning of the year and then address the stock to 2027. And in advance of that, we'll also be imposing much tougher conditions on all of the mobile network operators through the Telecom Security Bill. Essentially, what that is doing is shifting the balance from the Communications Act 2003, whereby it was essentially up to the mobile network operators to determine how best to ensure the security, through to this legislation that will involve the government setting out those requirements, and it will address those sort of issues.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister confirm the problem is not with Huawei's hardware, but with its software? Might an alternative be to mandate, as part of his Open Round solution, to mandate the use of open source software rather than proprietary software in the 5G network?
Secretary of State.
Well, I think the Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right to make this point about open source software, and we've certainly encouraged that to happen. And I think that greater transparency will help as we roll out the Open RAN networks. It is the case that the Huawei Evaluation Centre in GCHQ does look at both hardware and software issues.
Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In regards to our other networks, people in the telecoms industry have suggested to me it's not actually as difficult to replace the equipment as the representatives of the industry suggest. So can my right honourable friend confirm that in his technical consultation about supply chain alternatives, he'll push them to distinguish between things they'd prefer not to have to do and things which are genuinely impossible?
Secretary of State.
Yes. My honourable friend raised an important point. Of course, we will do that. I think it's just worth bearing in mind with all of this that it's not one decision, but it's the cumulative impact of all those decisions. So we've already imposed restrictions in January. We're imposing further restrictions on banning the procurement, and then we are imposing further restrictions again with 2027. You just get to a point on deliverability of this.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the decision in as much as it's progress of a kind. But let us not be so myopic as to think that the victory is complete. It's not. Because so long as Huawei continues to have its tentacles in other elements, key elements of public infrastructure, in other elements such as academia in our universities across the country, when it's giving huge sums of money to outfits such as the LSE, then we still have an issue. So has the myopia really come to an end? Is this decision part of a broader strategy to get Huawei out of places it ought not to be?
Secretary of State.
Well, this announcement relates principally to the sanctions that have been imposed by the US government and the consequence of it. The sort of wider points he raises, I think, are likely to be addressed through the Investment Security Bill, which will be coming before this House.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I add my voice to welcoming this vital decision in the interests of national security. Building on the earlier question from my honourable friend, the member for Bolsover, whilst for many of my constituents in rural Buckinghamshire, 5G will be game-changing, bluntly, any mobile signal that is reliable will be life-changing. So what assurances can my right honourable friend give me that the incredible shared rural network can be pushed up the agenda and delivered faster than it's currently scheduled to be?
Secretary of State.
Well, as my honourable friend knows, we signed the deal for the shared rural network just a few months ago, so that was incredible progress, and we'll continue to challenge them to go further and faster. And of course, in addition to that, I'm very mindful that when we talk about full fibre to the premises, there are many people who are still struggling with getting super fast, so we also need to make sure we get the super fast to the remaining 4% of households in the UK.
Question, Cavan Jones.
Security of our telecom network is the vital issue here. That's why I supported the government's announcement earlier this year on Huawei. He's caved into pressure from the United States and his own backbenchers, especially when some people on their backbenchers were actually in government during the golden years of relationship with China and said nothing then about human rights, now have found their consciousness. But can he say to me this? In terms of the telecoms bill, he's going to ban Huawei. If the United States changes its position, how do we then take Huawei out of that legislation? And will he actually ban Nokia and Ericsson using using components that are manufactured in China, which they do now. And can you just be honest with the public? It's not about the hardware, Minister, it's about hacking and the software. And that's what we should be concentrating on, not this.
Secretary of State.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right to highlight the wider risks to the network. And as I've said repeatedly, both previously and today, it would be exceptionally naive of us to think that if we just remove Huawei, we remove that risk. Sophisticated hostile state actors can, of course, infiltrate our networks. That's why we are toughening up considerably the security of our networks through the Telecoms Security Bill. And I think that is the correct approach.
Bob Seeley.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome much of what the Minister has said, and I'm grateful for him for being here. This does look like a long, slow goodbye to Huawei. But does he understand the concerns of some people here that 7 years is a very long time in politics and it would be better to be done sooner? Can he also understand that maybe the lesson from all this is that for a host of reasons, economic, security, geopolitics, high-risk vendors should not be in our critical national infrastructure?
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his constructive comments. I do genuinely understand the concerns expressed by him and by other members about this speed point, and it is one that was considered extensively by the National Security Council. In the end, we've made a balanced judgment about this. We believe that by having 2027 as a target, by the end of this Parliament, we would have put in law an irreversible process for the removal of it. The risk on the other side of going faster relates to the integrity of the network and the challenges around that. I'd rather we got to a point where we got it out completely by 2027. I think that is a realistic timetable for doing so.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order.